Hey, what's going on, AP guys? We have a video on the progressive era and how it is seen as a turning point. This could be a possible essay topic. So be able to identify and explain ways that the progressive era was different and the same as before and after the time period. Make sure you also check out other videos I have in the playlist of turning points. All right, before we begin, it's shout out time. Shout outs to the following classes: Mr. Maffey's in Florida, Mrs. Hams in Kentucky. I wonder if they live near Lexington, and Henry Clay. Mrs. Kimberly Popes in Texas, Mrs. Bakers from Brockton High School, and Mr. Amans in Wisconsin. Thank you all for watching. Best of luck. All right, let's do a quick overview of the progressive era. I do have a more detailed video in the description as well. So what was the progressive era? It was a period of increased government reform that includes local, state, and federal levels. This era also saw increased democracy, especially the 17th and 19th Amendments, which we'll talk about. And on the state levels, things like initiative, referendum, and recall. Initiative allows people to propose a law. The referendum allows people of a state to vote on a law. And a recall allows people of a state to recall or vote a government official out of office. We also see increased government involvement in the economy, things like the Food and Drug Administration, the Hepburn Act, and the Clayton Antitrust Act. Can you tell me in response to what was the FDA created? You know it, it's The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. We'll come back to that. So when was the progressive era? 1890s to 1920. Progressives tended to be journalists, middle and upper class individuals, a lot of women, and also urban residents. So we see the progressives are really focused in cities. Definitely know the characteristics of progressives, and also individuals that sought to use the government to improve problems of society. Okay, so let's talk about the U.S. before the progressive era. We have industrialization. During the Gilded Age, we have the growth of businesses. This leads to the emergence of trusts, monopolies, and other forms of consolidating power, and I have a video on that as well. And we see people like Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller emerge, and people begin to criticize them because they consolidated power, and they became very, very powerful and rich and influential. During this time, this led to emergence of unions and calls for business reform, such as the Interstate Commerce Act, which created the Interstate Commerce Commission, which regulated railroads, the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was meant to break up trusts, but in actuality was used against unions. With industrialization comes urbanization. We have the growth of large cities, especially in New York City and Chicago. And we see a lot of immigrants and poor living in tenement housing, very cramped apartments that are run down. New immigrants, people from Southern and Eastern Europe, they predominantly lived in cities and often in ethnic enclaves. And we see a rise of nativism. Again, anytime we're talking about large amounts of immigrants, we see a rise of nativism. An example is the American Protective Association, which sought to ban Catholics from holding office. And they wanted to limit the amount of immigrants coming to this country. Okay, so let's jump over to politics before the progressive era. On state and local levels, we have political machines, especially in cities that exerted a lot of power. Tammany Hall in New York City. They would provide services to immigrants and poor in exchange for support and voting. On the national level, senators were elected by state legislatures, and this led to calls for direct elections. This is a populist idea, the idea that citizens of a state should be able to vote for their senators. And the reason, populists argued, was that these monopolies and trusts had too much influence over state legislatures, which also had influence over state senators. So here's a very famous political cartoon from Puck magazine, and you see it says the bosses of the Senate. Down here is the title, and entrance for monopolists. So who are the people who really have the power according to this political cartoon? You have the Copper Trust, the Steel Beam Trust, Standard Oil Trust, etc. It's these monopolies and trusts. Half the population could not vote prior to the progressive era, and that's women. When we're talking about economics, there's no federal income tax, and that leads to calls for a graduated income tax. That means the more money you make, the more you pay in taxes. And populists also advocated government ownership of railroads, telegraphs, and telephones. So the big idea from the populist era is they want government involvement. Now, there was a candidate who ran for president 3 times and lost all 3 times and advocated these populist ideas. Do you know who it is? It's everybody's favorite 3-time presidential loser. No, it's not Henry Clay. It is this guy, William Jennings Bryan. He ran in the election of 1896. Got a video in the description for you as well. Okay, let's jump over to major social progressive era milestones. We're going to talk about muckrakers. These are authors that expose societal ills and problems. People like Upton Sinclair. The Jungle, again, described the horrible conditions in meatpacking factories, led to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act. Jacob Riis, he wrote How the Other Half Lives and demonstrated the living conditions of the poor and immigrants in New York City. This led to many tenements in New York City being torn down. And you see Jacob Riis back here with his good buddy, then Police Commissioner Teddy Roosevelt. They would walk the streets of New York City at night and examine the city. Jane Addams and the Hull House, definitely know Jane Addams. The Hull House was created to aid women, children, and immigrants, and this inspired other settlement houses throughout the country. And they really focused on educating women, children, and immigrants to adapt or assimilate to American life. The 18th Amendment is another social milestone. This is prohibition, that making alcohol illegal. And this is a fulfillment of the temperance movement goals from the early to mid 19th century. So this is an idea that had been around for a long time, but finally comes to fruition during the Progressive era. Now, talking about political milestones on the state and local level, we have the initiative referendum recall, which I mentioned earlier, and this is seen in Wisconsin with Robert La Follette, who becomes governor and also senator from Wisconsin. And we also have the adoption of the secret ballot, or the Australian ballot, which again is a populist idea. On the national level, we have the direct election of senators with the 17th Amendment, and the 19th Amendment allows for women's suffrage. And here's a very famous suffragette, Alice Paul, who would petition Woodrow Wilson to support women's suffrage. The Clayton Antitrust Act strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act that was passed years earlier, and this exempted labor unions from prosecution. So this gave more power to break up trust, but exempted unions from being prosecuted. Conservation is a big part. This is focusing on the environment. The Newlands Reclamation Act, this funded irrigation projects out west. And the Antiquities Act allowed the president to set aside land to create national monuments. So a lot of federal land was set aside and not used by businesses and industries. Some economic progressive milestones. We had the Northern Securities decision, which broke up J.P. Morgan's company. This was a large trust at the time. Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft were known as trust busters, and they broke up many trusts. The Underwood Tariff was a tariff passed under the Democrat Wilson. So what does this do to the tariff rates if he is a Democrat? You know it goes down, and many people were calling for lower tariffs. The 16th Amendment creates a graduated income tax, and we also have the Federal Reserve Act, which created the Federal Reserve. It's still around today, and this is the U.S.'s central banking system, and they could print U.S. money. Now, there's always debates about who should be on the U.S. bills, and it makes perfect sense to have a guy who killed the third bank of the United States to be on essentially the new bank. Doesn't make sense. Andrew Jackson hated banks, and he's on the $20 bill. Go figure. The Federal Reserve could increase and decrease the supply of money. Okay, let's jump over to the U.S. after the Progressive era, the election of 1820. We have Warren G., not the rapper, but Warren G. Harding. He campaigns on a return to normalcy. What does this mean? Well, this is a call for less government involvement in the economy, back to laissez-faire ideas. So this is pretty much trying to undo a lot of the Progressive era legislation, and also a return to isolationism or neutrality with the rejection of the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations from World War I. Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon was a Treasury Secretary throughout the 1920s, and he advocated lower taxes for the wealthy. And this is a similar idea that we will see with Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, this idea of trickle-down economics, cutting taxes for the wealthy. The 21st Amendment reversed the 18th Amendment, and prohibition is over in 1933, and that's because the government really needed revenue. Now, when it comes to immigration, we'll see two acts in particular in the 1920s that reverse unlimited immigration to the U.S. and severely restricts immigration, especially for those new immigrants. All right, so you ultimately, if you have an essay on a turning point for the Progressive era, need to determine, was it a turning point? If you want to argue yes, then you could write about things like changes to democracy, the 17th and 19th Amendments on the federal level, and the initiative referendum recall on the local levels, as well as the secret ballot. You can mention changes for poor and immigrants and consumers through things like the Hull House, the elimination of some tenements, and the Pure Food and Drug Act. Also increased government involvement in the economy through the Hepburn Act, which regulated railroads, the Clayton Antitrust Act, and the Federal Reserve Act, as well as trust busting. If you want to say that no, it does not support a turning point, you can spend time writing about how African Americans still face discrimination, segregation, and many other obstacles such as literacy tests and poll taxes. In fact, the Niagara movement from the early 1900s, this was a precursor to the NAACP. People like W.E.B. Du Bois had to meet in Niagara Falls, Canada, because in Niagara Falls, New York, they were barred from going to a hotel that was segregated to have their meeting, so they had to go to Canada. Prohibition was overturned in the 1930s, so there's this need for revenue, and the government economic regulation decreased in the 1920s under Warren G. Harding's call for a return to normalcy and the tax policies of Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon. All right, we'll finish up with some test tips. Multiple choice of short answer. Know the characteristics of progressives as well as their goals. Be able to identify an excerpt from Jacob Riis, Jane Addams, and Upton Sinclair, and think about how that relates to the progressive era. Progressive amendments. Absolutely know the 16th through 19th amendments. And ways democracy increased on state and federal levels. For essays, progressive era is a turning point. That's really what this video is about, as well as comparing the progressive era to perhaps the populist era or the government involvement under both the progressive era and the New Deal, or the progressive era and the Great Society. So those are potential essay topics that you could encounter. I thank you guys very much for watching. Please make sure you check out the playlist that covers other turning points for potential essay topics. And best of luck on all your exams, especially the one in May. You're brilliant. You will do great. Thank you for watching. And oh, by the way, tell me what this picture is from. Put in the comments, what book is this picture from? Have a good day.